Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Prof Kondlo, wow, where do I start? What a profound professorial address, which there tackles an issue that embedded scholarship will conveniently ignore: presidential leadership and ethical leadership. Professor Rensbeck, I think Professor Kondlo adequately responded to the professorial call. Thank you so much, Prof Kondlo, to have themed your inauguration around this important issue, which, as you correctly observe, not much has been researched about it. From the construct that constitute the thematic essence of your address, one could immediately pick up a very interesting conceptual problematic, which you ingeniously untangle to contextualize your contentions. What do you term a dialectical disclosure? What do you define as a gap between politics and ethics? Which some argue that the pursuit of the two is intended to achieve different ends. And as such, some scholars tend to conclude that politics and ethics are necessarily binary opposites. To this extent, therefore, the question that forces us to consider is whether the praxis of politics can be ethicalized. In your argument, you provide thought leadership in answering this question, which is largely answered in affirmative. By so doing, you demonstrate that professorship is about being at the cutting edge of ideas, where inventiveness in thought matters. Your inventiveness in dealing with what is mostly considered the binary opposites is exemplified in your contention that apparent gap between ethical and political actually marks the call to ethical duty to reinvent the political for the humanization of the human world. This is a very important point which I wanted to get to it with a question. How do we inculcate the culture of ethical duty in our political leadership for the humanization of the human world? This is the question that, as I listen to you, Prof, I'm compelled to ask, precisely because it is important as it introduces yet another important thematic trait that needs further reflection to, in a way, make an input to ethical leadership framework model for presidential leadership that you are proposing. Where does the answer to the question about inculcating the culture of ethical duty lie? As my imagination meanders around this question, I'm tempted, Prof, to invoke Plato's concept of the philosopher-ruler, where in his The Republic makes a very important point for consideration as you engage us in a discourse on presidential leadership and the imperative of ethical duty. This is what he said, I quote, "If you want a well-governed state to be possible, you must find for your future rulers some way of life they like better than government. For only then you'll have a government by the truly rich, those, that is, whose riches consist not of gold, but of the true happiness of a good and a rational life." Close quote. I think this is where we need to start as we inculcate the culture of ethical duty in the political leadership. Because, as Plato warns, if we get in public affairs men whose life is impoverished and destitute of personal satisfaction, but who hope to snatch some compensation from their own inadequacy from a political career, there can never be a good government, for they will start fighting for power, and consequently internal and domestic conflicts will reign both them and society. So, to establish the culture of ethical leadership, it is perhaps important to also look at the question of interrogating the process that spawns political leadership. Influence it to give us only those who do not love power. But so agree. Aren't we chasing a pie in the sky, impelled by an illusion of the possibility of angels in government? Isn't that politics is inherently about power, which Lord Acton warned that it tends to corrupt, that when it becomes absolute, it corrupts absolutely. In our country, check and balances are in place to mitigate the possibility of absolute power. But the question is, to what extent do all these arrangements constitute to ethical leadership? Prof, your address uses the case a study of presidential leadership in South Africa to illustrate ethical duty, which in some instances is betrayed. By the way, in your dialectical trail, I missed President Kgalema Motlanthe. He was part of the presidency. It would have been very interesting for him to also be there. But the point that I wanted to emphasize, Prof, like as I pointed out earlier on, your address uses the case study of presidential leadership in South Africa to illustrate ethical duty, which in some instances is betrayed. What happens when an ethical duty is betrayed? Government becomes an endangered species, and this becomes unfortunate, and it is unnecessary. As Alfred Marshall reminds us, I quote, "Government is the most precious of human possession, and no care can be too great to be spent on enabling it to do its work in the best way." This, Prof, underscores the significance of ethical duty in political leadership. Thank you very much.